I know I just said that we would move on to the UI and scoring right now, but there's actually some small bugs and issues that I think we need to resolve before we move on to anything new. There are at least 2 gameplay related bugs that I've noticed, and there are a couple visual quirks that I want to improve. So we'll start with the gameplay related bugs. And so one of them I mentioned earlier in the previous video comments you may have seen on screen. If you do something like this, this won't be a great example because there's going to be a match, but if you split your quad vertically like this and let it fall, then the player is still able to control both halves of it when they shouldn't, and that's going to lead to weird bugs like that where false matches are made and the player shouldn't be able to control like this, obviously. So luckily there's a pretty quick fix to this. All we need to do is make it so that once the quad splits, it drops quickly and the player is not able to control it any longer. So we already have all the logic in place for that. We just need to wire up a few things. So that shouldn't take more than a few minutes to fix. We'll go ahead and do that now. So if we go to this part of the player controller where we have all the logic for splitting the quad, if the quad gets split, that means we're right here. So when both halves cannot fall, one or the other can't fall, we're right here. So if we just add some logic there to make it quick drop. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to quickly go over here, and this is the quick drop. These 2 nodes represent a quick drop. So like when the player presses the drop input action, then we set this boolean and we call this function or this event immediately so that it will, start falling immediately. Otherwise we have to wait for this timer to tick down. So we force the immediate event, and then we have this boolean so that it starts dropping faster. So I want to consolidate these 2 things into just one function, even though it's only 2 nodes. Having it as one function will help. I'm actually going to make it another node. I'm going to put a branch here and say only in the case where this boolean is not currently set will we set it and run this. Otherwise the player could spam this action really quickly and cause this function to fire really quickly, faster than we intended. So this will prevent that from happening. So they can only press it once per quad that they're controlling. So we just say get is quad dropping faster, and if that is not true, so not boolean, if this value is false, then we do these 2 things. So I'm going to consolidate this into a separate function. So like this. Otherwise we're just going to do nothing. So I'm going to collapse this to a function. Call it initiate quick drop, or whatever you think is a fitting name for that functionality. And then all we need is, we don't need anything to connect to it. So we can remove this connection and these nodes and just do this instead. So every time you press the space bar in our case, it'll check to see if you are currently dropping faster. And if you're not dropping faster, it'll start dropping faster. Otherwise, it'll just return from this function. And the reason why I wanted to make this function, partly to fix that spamming capability, I want this function so that I can reuse this logic in that commented block in the event graph. So now we have it here. We want to do the same thing here. If if the quad has been split vertically, we want to initiate quick drop, but we want to make sure we only do it once. That's why we have the boolean check in there to make sure it only runs it once. Otherwise we could get an infinite loop where it's going to initiate over and over again, because it'll call, it's going to happen really, really fast. So we want to make sure we have that boolean check there. So this should fix that issue. Let's see. Hopefully it doesn't crash the project. So I want to make sure the quick dropping works as before. So this is the same functionality we had before. And I also want to make a tower of non-matched blocks here, and then see what happens if I let it slide off like this. Okay, that's what we want to have happen. We want the quad to break of its own accord and fall faster and prevent the player from moving while it's falling. So that's one issue sorted out. Another issue, which I only realized was a existing bug when I was trying to fix that previous bug that we just fixed, it's a bit timing sensitive, so it's pretty insidious and hard to notice sometimes, but it can sometimes happen when you initiate a quick drop while your quad blocks are overlapping the timer bar. Like this, sometimes you'll get a drop where your blocks will go one column further than they should, downwards. Let's see if I can replicate that. Like, see, there we go. So if your block is overlapping the timer bar and you drop down, then you'll sometimes drop one row further than you're supposed to, and that will lead to some really heinous bugs where you have two blocks overlapping each other and it's hard to tell, and then you get incorrect matches because it's matching with both color blocks in the same slot. So if you have like this, let's see if we can replicate that here when we're on top of these blocks. It can be hard to notice, but you can drop down and then two blocks will go inside each other. Like there, I think it just happened. If we inspect this area somewhere here, there's going to be two blocks on top of each other right here, see? So that is definitely very bad news. That'll lead to huge bugs later where there's matches that it's just not good at all. So I think the reason why this is happening, I haven't diagnosed it fully yet, but I think it's because you're overlapping the timer bar, and the checks we have for falling that the blocks perform, the player controller performs it rather, is it checks to see the first thing that it collides with underneath it, and if it's not a block or the grid, it's going to keep falling. So if the first thing it overlaps is the timer bar, it's going to say, oh, that's something that I can move through, so let's move through it. But in fact, you don't want to move through it. So what we need to do instead is either put the timer bar somehow like on a different channel, or we can maybe just improve the logic we have here in the player controller for check move down. What's happening is we're doing our first line trace. What we should probably do instead is a multi-line trace and make sure that we're not hitting either of these things. So right here, the logic is if the thing that we overlapped is not the grid or the block BP, then we can continue to fall. So we want to improve this logic somehow. So I think probably the simplest fix here is to do a multi-line trace instead of just a single line trace, and check all objects hit to make sure that none of them are this, not just the first one we found. And that should solve our problem. And it shouldn't be that hard to do. All we need to do is copy this part, add a multi-line trace instead of single line trace here. So I'll copy this, and then I need to add a for each loop here. And then split here instead of splitting the pin on the line trace node. And then put the actor here, just like we had here. So now it's just going to check each actor that we hit along this line instead of just the first one, and make sure that none of them are the grid or another block, not just the first one we hit. And that is going to, all we need to do here is just connect these same nodes in the same order. It's a very similar node here. And after I test this to see if it works, I'll delete all this and just slide this into place. So one thing we need to be careful of here though is our old logic had these two variables initially false, and we set them to true if the first thing we hit was not one of these two objects. But we need to invert that logic here kind of and set these to initially true. That way it'll only turn false if we hit one of these two things. Otherwise, it'll remain true. We can't set it true, false on every single iteration of the loop, because then the only thing that matters is the last thing we hit in the trace, which that's not going to solve the problem. So we need to remove this node here and only set the booleans to false if any of the objects we hit is one of these two. Just one thing, just one instance of either of these two things sets it to false, and otherwise it's true. That's an important change we have to make from the old way of doing it. So now we just need to hook this up instead of the single trace. And same thing for the other side, the other half of the quad, the left half. We can just copy and paste this for the most part. And then just switch the boolean from right half can fall to left half can fall. And then just drag all these things into this node. And that should do it. I may have forgotten something here. Let's see. I think that's going to do it. So if we compile this, and now I can't do like a thorough playtesting of this. I just don't have the time to playtest this for hours and hours and try to find the case where this logic may fail. But just based on my understanding of what the initial problem was and why it was falling through sometimes, I think this should resolve that issue. And at the very least, it's partially resolved. I think it solves it though. So that's the two gameplay related bugs that are pretty important to fix. We fixed those relatively quickly. Now I'm going to fix, or improve a few other aspects of the project that are perhaps a bit lacking in their polish. So one thing I'm going to do real quick, or not real quick, first I'm going to do what I said I would do and move the new logic into proper place. Like so. Make sure that line is totally horizontal. And then delete this. And just move the new logic up so it's where the old logic was. Oh, actually I connected it to this reroute node so that it's straight across here. And that should do it. Let's see if it still works, if I didn't accidentally delete something important. Okay, so now some of the functions that I've made in Blueprints so far in this series have been functions that don't alter any data, they just return like a value. And functions like that, for instance, I think it's in the game mode. I called it is this block part of the quad. Let's find all the places where this is used in the entire project. A couple of places. So let's, for instance, go to this one. Now this function takes in a value and it returns a value, but it's not actually altering anything. It's just taking in the input data and running an operation and then outputting something, but it's not modifying this data. So I should be able to make this a pure function, which means that it's not modifying anything. So we can do it whenever it needs to be done. Like, let's see what happens if I check it and then compile. There might be some issues, but the places where we call that function are now replaced like so. I guess it did it automatically, which is pretty convenient. But the important thing here is that we don't have to connect the execute pins. And so it's now, this function is ran on a need to know basis, so like it runs only when it's required. So when this branch executes, it's going to then look for this function and run it. Whereas before we were running it explicitly through the execute pins and then saving its temporary variable for later use. The only thing this really does is simplify our execution path. Now this is a pure function, which means it doesn't have to have the execution pins on it. And that allows you to kind of put less focus on the order in which you're doing things, because obviously we needed this result in order to run this branch, but when we have a pure function, it kind of takes the impetus of running it explicitly off of the the programmer, and just lets the system decide when it needs to run. So that was a long way of saying that basically it cleans up your blueprints a little bit and makes things a little bit smoother looking. Like here I had to run this explicitly, but now I can just sort of move it off of the execution pins. It's obviously not essential to do this, but there was also no reason to have it be an impure function when it really was pure under the hood, just to not have it run through the pins unnecessarily, the execution pins. So let's see if it still works after I made that change. So we want to make sure that the timer bar isn't interacting with the player quad. That's why we ran that function. But everything still seems to be working as before, which is good. So there are probably a few other functions that we can make pure, like probably all the check functions, I imagine. Like this isn't modifying any data, it's just taking in the data from the outside of this function and then returning a value. But I'm not going to go ahead and change every single function into a pure function. That can be, but going forward, that's a good habit to get into. Is if you're making a function, say, do I really need this to execute explicitly, or can I make it a pure function because it's only it's like a helper function that returns something useful without modifying the state of any other variables outside of itself. So that was one thing I wanted to clean up a little bit, and another thing I wanted to refine is the visual effect for when the preview quad right here dissolves and the player's one appears right here. You'll notice that they're not synchronized, so when the player one kind of appears at a different rate as the preview one disappears. And I kind of want to make them... Oh, that was a bug. If a solid block drops slowly, it seems to cause a problem. Let's see what happens if a normal block drops slowly. Okay, no, it's any block that drops slowly seems to have that problem. But only when they don't split, right? So if one splits and drops slowly, let's see if that still works properly. Okay, so when it splits by falling automatically, it works. And when you drop it quickly, it works. But if you let a block drop by itself all the way to the bottom and then don't do a quick drop here, it seems to break and then blocks spawn on top of themselves over and over again, which is obviously bad. So okay, so what's happening is it's dropping slowly, and then we get to this point where where neither of them can drop, because right, it's not just splitting, but both of them are stopping at the same time. And then so we actually need to modify this and have the initiate quick drop only happen when only one of the two is falling. But when they both stop at the same time, which would be the case here, then we want to not do this, right? So let's try modifying that and putting these like this, or maybe even like this. So we initiate quick drop and then we move only the half that can move. But if we're in a case where neither half can move and we want to finish falling, we don't want to initiate quick drop. So let's try doing that, see what happens. So again, in the case where only the left half can drop, and in the case where only the right half can drop, we do a quick drop. But if neither half can drop, then we don't initiate quick drop. So now let's see what happens. Quick drops still seem to be working as before. And now let's see what happens if I let this drop automatically, slowly, by itself. Now we seem to have proper behavior, so that was just a logical inconsistency where I made no distinction in the logic before about whether it was a split or not split fall. So I was neglecting the situation where a non-split fall was occurring, and I didn't properly account for that. But now it seems to be working. So back to what I was saying earlier about the dissolve rate of the preview quad versus the player quad appearing. I want to make it so it's like a perfect one-to-one transition. So even if I change the slope, right now it's the slope that is part of the problem, right? So the rate at which the preview quad disappears. So this is the dissolve rate. It dissolves in half a second at a linear rate, and the player's blocks appear. Let's see, where's the begin play? When they dissolve in, it's at this semi-sloped exponential rate here. So if I change this to 0.5, let's just do this to get it, simple and make sure that they mirror each other. So let's just do a linear. Let's get rid of this keyframe here. I think I can just delete this key, right? Somehow. With the delete button. Yes. I pressed delete on the keyboard after having it left clicked. So now I'm just going to set this to 0.5. So it perfectly mirrors what the preview quad is doing, right? 0 to 0.5, 0 to 0.5. So even if this is the case, there's another issue where if we pause and go through frame by frame, you'll notice something is wrong, even though they should, be mirroring each other. What's actually happening is clearly they're not, right? So if we go about halfway between, you'll notice that it's not that they are mirroring each other, they're doing, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but you'll see it's the same exact pattern, right? So it's not like the same sections of the cube are disappearing here and appearing here. We in fact have the same section in both. So it ruins the illusion of teleportation from one area to the other because it's not the same segments of the block that are missing, right? Oh, it is the segments of the block that are missing. So it's not like this part has what this one lacks. That's what we want, right? We want this one to be appearing at the same places where this one is disappearing. Whereas right now, they're missing the same chunks. We want this to be the chunks that are missing from this one. In order to do that, I believe what we need to do is have an inverted texture and have that be the texture that these guys use, so that as this one is disappearing, this one is appearing with those same segments that were missing from this one. So all I did was I took if you look at these, if you examine these thumbnails here, this one is inverted compared to this one. So everything that's white in this one is black in this one, and vice versa. So I did this in paint.net, which is a free image editing tool, but you can probably do it in any image editor. So all I need to do is use this texture on the player blocks. So if I make a new material that just uses the same logic as these ones but uses a different texture, then actually I can probably use the same base and just make sure this texture is a parameter. So it is a parameter, I just need to override it in the children. So I'm going to make a new material instance from the dissolve bases, and I'm just going to call it dissolve inst 0 underscore block, and do the same thing here with a dissolve instance 1 underscore block, as opposed to these ones which are for the preview. I'm going to change the name of these to preview once I get this changed. Or I guess I'll do it now so I don't forget. So the ones that are previously called dissolve inst 0, I'm going to change the name to underscore preview. And same with this one, just to differentiate it from the block ones now. And these I just need to change this texture parameter to be the inverted texture. And then same with this one, I just changed this to inverted as well. Save that. Now I need to make sure to change the material on these blocks when we initialize them with the dissolve mesh material here to be the, not the preview, but the block 1 and block 0. And now hopefully, if they happen at the same exact moment, which they might not happen at the same moment yet, but we can change that logic so they do, they should, you know, more accurately appear to teleport piece by piece from the left-hand side of the screen to the middle. So as those pieces disappear, it should be those same pieces appearing here, but we can see that they're not at the same rate happening. So it's certainly closer, but the preview quad disappears before the player quad starts. So yeah, it's close, but not quite at the same exact moment. Let's track where that's happening and see if we can improve the synchronization between the two elements. They should be happening like in the same frame, where the player quad spawns here and the preview quad despawns here. So they should be happening at the same exact time, but something to do with the way the what 0% looks like, you know, like what 1% dissolved looks like differs from what 99% dissolved looks like somehow, so they're not perfectly synchronized in that fashion. If we look again at what happens when one quad begins to dissolve, you first notice it like in this part of the square, but we don't see that part of the square here yet. But if we skip forward a few more frames, we'll start to see that part of the square appearing, right? But it's lagging behind by a few frames. So we can try to, you know, find what works better, kind of just by trial and error. When we spawn in the, like here, you know, maybe we'll add a keyframe in here and just drag it down a little bit and see what that does. It requires fine-tuning to get it perfect, obviously, but we'll see what happens if we tweak it a little bit. And I'll see if I can find a decent value and just tell you what that is, so you don't have to see me do a bunch of trial and error. And maybe having it finish earlier too. I think it's a little bit, it's closer. Even if it's not perfect, it's close enough to get the point across. you're free to try to tweak that and get slightly better values so that it more accurately dissolves. Or you may not even like the preview, like the dissolve pattern I've chosen, so you may prefer it to just literally appear at once, or some other way of having them transition from one side to the other. So yeah, we've got that one patch. But now, yeah, if you look closely, I think now we've overcorrected, and now the player quad is spawning in faster than the preview is disappearing. I can drag this a little bit, and maybe drag this a tiny bit over here. Okay, I think I've found some values that I'm happy with. So the one last thing I want to add in this video is perhaps the smallest, the least important thing, is I'm just going to add a cube to the scene. That's just a completely black cube. So I'm going to make a material that, or I might not even need a material. In fact, if I just use the default material and then go to the lighting settings and go to the lighting channels and set it to channel, like no channels. That way it doesn't receive light from any sources. So it's just going to be a black box, absence of any reflected light. And I want that to just be placed like in front of where the preview quads spawn in, so I can block the sudden appearance of the bottommost quads. I want to have them, slide in from, almost like slide in from the void, which will more closely, replicates the way that the original Lumines looks when it spawns in the blocks. Like, I'll show you what I'm talking about right now when I eject, and I'll highlight what I'm talking about. So when the new quad spawns in from underneath, if I have this block in the way now, when they appear, they seem to slide in from nowhere, which is more close to how it appears in the real game. So right here, when the blocks start spawning in, we'll hopefully just see a sliver of it, and then more of it appear over, like, coming up out of nowhere from the middle of the screen, as opposed to suddenly appearing all at once. I may need to move the square up or down a little bit to improve the effect, but here you see just like a sliver of it coming out. That's because of the, if we eject, it's because of this square right here. It's literally coming out of the square. But we could move this cube so it's not literally coming out of it if we just stop and move the cube a little bit forward, just so that the camera is blocking it, but not that it's literally touching the cubes. It should be the same visual effect now, where it slides up out of nowhere. So now we have them sliding up out of, not the bottom of the screen, but some part near the bottom of the screen like that. That's very similar to how it looks in the PSP version. So that's really all the bug fixes that I wanted to get across, and some of the changes I wanted to make. So now we'll finally move on to the scoring and the UI and game over state and all that fun stuff to finish up the essential parts of the game. You want the player to immediately know what they're doing, so maybe it's better like this. That's a interesting bug. So if I place this like right then, see, it doesn't, so I guess when it's placed right when the timer bar is coming through and it's above things, then it won't fall like that. I think we need to go and try to fix that before we worry about adding the scoring, because it's pretty central. If you're trying to play the game at a high level of speed, you're going to be making matches like this all the time, up against the clock like that, and then you're going to get floating, things like this. So that's obviously not good. So we have one more major gameplay bug to deal with, And that is the situation where it's not super easy to reproduce, but it does happen sometimes. So like that. So I think the problem is the block is not being added to the list of blocks that need to drop, because the blocks are getting highlighted, and then between the time when the column checker checks for the blocks that need to be dropped and the time when the blocks actually get cleared, the more blocks are added on top. So yeah, this is just all over the place in terms of reliability. So I think this something is wrong with the way that we're selecting which blocks will be dropped. Okay, so I just spent about 90 minutes trying to debug and come up with a solution for the problem of not dropping certain blocks when they are placed on top of blocks that have already been highlighted before the timer bar clears the highlighted blocks. So I'm probably going to cut all of that out of the video and just show you the summarized notes here at the end after I've fixed it. So the root of the problem was when we did the scan column for blocks function, we tried to find a highlighted block, and then after we found the first highlighted block in that column, we looked above it and added all of the blocks above it to the blocks array. But the blocks array would then become outdated if the player added more blocks on top of those blocks before the timer bar cleared the highlighted blocks. So we were relying on an array of outdated information when we used this to drop all blocks. So we no longer need this. I'll show you what I added, but all we need to do now is, check and see if we found a highlighted block in this column, and if we did, then we return true from this function. We no longer have the logic here for checking to see if we, dropping all blocks if there wasn't a highlighted in this column. We move that out to the top level event graph. I can delete this. So what we're doing now is when we overlap a column checker, we run scan column for blocks, and now this function has an output Boolean. Instead of running that check down here, we used to have it down here. I pulled it out of this function because this function shouldn't do 5 things at once. So all it does is returns true or false for whether there's a highlighted block in this column. And if there was not a highlighted block in the current column that we scanned, then delete this function too, don't need it. If there's not a highlighted block in the current column, then we run this function, which is just what we had before in the other inside of this function at the bottom. So now we check to see if our highlighted array has any values in it, which these get added inside here. If we encounter a block that was matched, we make it highlighted, and then we add it to the highlighted array here. So now we check to see if that array is at least of length 1, which means it has values in it. And if it does, then we iterate through it, destroy the highlighted blocks, and then we clear this array so that it's empty again. But the reason why we do this check to make sure it's not empty is so that we only run this function when we need to, because this function has been overhauled as well. Drop all blocks to fill gaps. It used to rely on blocks array and iterated through all of those, but now it makes its own array. So that way we're ensuring that we have the latest information. We make our own array right after the highlighted blocks got destroyed. We make a new array of all of the blocks, every single one in the grid, and drop them row by row. So now we just, I don't need, this was a debug, I don't need this anymore. So instead of relying on blocks array, which we no longer using at all, so we can go ahead and remove that from the timer bar. Let's make sure we're not using it anywhere. anywhere in any blueprint. It's being used here, but only because I haven't erased it yet. So right here, I can destroy this. We're no longer using the blocks array that's tied to the timer bar anywhere. So we should be able to remove it. So let's make sure it's not being used anywhere. And let's remove blocks array. Instead of building that blocks array column by column, we're now making it all at once here. All blocks in order. Inside of this function, we're going row by row, starting at the bottom left row. Well, I'll show you like this when we make a match and then clear the highlighted blocks. Right here, we go from the left to the right of every single row, except the bottom one, because the blocks in the bottom row can never drop, so there's no need to check them and make them drop. So we just start here and we scan across every single row, looking for all blocks that are not the player quad. And then if we find one, we add it to all blocks in order. And I say in order just so that they are bottom row first, they drop, next row, they drop, next row, they drop. If we collect them from bottom to top like this, then when we iterate through them in drop all blocks to fill gaps, they're dropping with nothing underneath them that hasn't dropped yet. So everything underneath a currently dropping block is already in its final destination for this function. So it's going to drop knowing that it drops to its final resting position. So that's what's happening here in make array of all blocks in grid. We're going row by row, starting from the bottom, one row up to the top row, just scanning across from left to right. So starting at the root of the grid and then going up 1/2 of a vertical offset so that we're in the center of each row. Otherwise we'd be, so we go up 1/2 of one and then we go one offset for the first iteration of the for loop, and then we go another offset, another offset, another offset. So that's what's happening here when we have 1/2 of an offset plus our current index of this for loop is how many total offsets we are from our root position at the bottom left of the grid. And that's our starting location, and then our ending location is the same thing plus the total horizontal offset all the way across the grid, so that we go through the entire row. And then we're ignoring the grid. And for everything that we hit in this multi-line trace, we check to see if it's a valid block. And if it is a valid block and not part of the player's quad, then we add it to all blocks in order. So I'll go ahead and remove these unnecessary nodes now. So you can copy this if you want to solve the problem we've been having before with not drop blocks. Go ahead and follow along what I'm showing you and just add these to your blueprints. I am trying to spare you from watching 90 minutes of me going down a rabbit hole trying to fix all these bugs and ending up making it more confusing, but I think this solution I've reached is better than our original solution, and it's not that much more confusing. And it's hopefully not that much more inefficient. I think it's a bit wasteful, but not that wasteful in terms of system resources. So now we're going row by row, adding everything to all blocks in order, and then in drop all blocks to fill gaps, we just go through all of these blocks and drop them as far as possible. This function has been unchanged. It's what we originally wrote for the individual block dropping behavior. And then after everything's dropped to its final position, we update we check all blocks for matches again, so that if they fell into a position which resulted in a new match, that they become matched. And then we clear this array so that it's not full of things that don't need to drop anymore. And then we just return from drop all blocks to fill gaps, which means we then return from this function, which means we're back to the end of this branch here. And the gameplay continues from there. So now, I haven't tested this super thoroughly, but so far no errors or warnings, and everything seems to be working properly. There's no longer a situation where you get hanging blocks if you add blocks on top of highlighted blocks like this. Before, those blocks would have been hanging, but now they fall properly. So that's very good. It's finally working as it should. And this, of course, as I say, working as it should, now we have a new error. But this is happening because we don't have any functionality to account for becoming unmatched. So I talked about this a long time ago, but we have our blocks and they can become matched and become unmatched, but we don't have any. This isn't implemented, right? We don't have anything for become unmatched. So we have blocks become matched once they, reach their matched state, but we don't have any logic to account for blocks becoming unmatched as a result of blocks below them falling. So we should fix that now. That's another smaller bug. It's not nearly as game breaking as the floating blocks. So now we need to account for matched but not highlighted matched blocks becoming unmatched as a result of the blocks below them separating the match. So to do that, when we check for matches on all blocks, each block is going to determine matches, right? And here we have our total number of matched neighbors. And if it's, if the ones up and to the right of us are all the same color as us, then that means there was one match. Or, there can be up to 4 matches if we're surrounded on all 8 sides. But so here we have logic that says if num matches is greater than 0, and we are currently unmatched, then we become matched. But we need sort of the reverse, where if the number of matches is equal to 0 and our current state is matched, we need to become unmatched. So we'll just add a separate branch here that says if num matches, well, the only case will be here is if num matches is equal to 0, right? So if we're on this execution pin, that means num matches is equal to 0. So here we need to say if my state is matched, then we need to become unmatched. So become unmatched. And this will also involve reversing the timeline of transitioning the color and material, but that won't be too bad. So this is a case that's a little bit hard to test for, right? Because it's pretty rare to encounter that in just limited playtesting, but this can definitely happen, as we just saw in that previous demo. So if we're currently matched, and on the latest update we're back to 0 matches around us, then we need to become unmatched. Otherwise, we don't call that function. Otherwise, we would transition from matched to unmatched when we're not even matched yet. So there we go. That should be good. Now we need to actually implement become unmatched, which is just going to set our state to unmatched and do a reverse of this transition. So in become unmatched, we set our state to unmatched. And instead of doing this, we need to do like the opposite of this. So we can basically duplicate this logic and change the variables around. So I'll go ahead and add that in here. So we'll make a new event called color transition matched to unmatched. And we set our current material as the starting value, and we set our unmatched inst here, block color 1 unmatched inst, block color 1 unmatched inst, and block color 0 unmatched inst. And then we need to set our scale from the matched scale to the unmatched scale, so it shrinks back down to the smaller scale. And that should do it. We need to actually make sure we call that here. Instead of unmatched to matched, we want to call matched to unmatched. And now we need to see if that happens. So that's going to be kind of hard to do to make it happen here, but I'll try. So I'm going to try it here. Let's see if it works. After these ones get highlighted, I'm going to make this match. And they got split, and you see how they became unmatched. So now that works. Let's see if they can become matched again and get highlighted and properly cleared from the game. So they don't end up in some sort of weird limbo state where they can't be matched again. It looks like they can be matched again, and it's all working properly. I haven't noticed any issues so far in this run. So we're finally in a state where the gameplay actually functions properly. It only took 17 episodes or however many videos I've made so far. And they fall into place and update their matches properly. So good, now we've fixed most of the bugs that every bug that I've been able to actually find. There's probably hidden bugs that haven't been exposed yet, but so far I think I've found all the ones that have presented themselves to me and tried my best to fix them. So hopefully, if I cut out that 90 minutes of debugging, hopefully you've been able to follow along and fix up the blueprints where I made changes. And now everything is finally working, so we can go ahead and go back to adding the scoring and the UI and combo system and game over state. And before I end this video, I'm just going to do a bit more cleanup of the blueprints that I left in a bit of a mess as I was trying to debug this dropping blocks problem. There's this variable is no longer being used anywhere, so I can delete this. As well as this variable up here, current column. I added that a long time ago and never ended up using it, and I never deleted that, so that can also be removed from the timer bar blueprint. And I think there's something else. Okay, the one last thing we need to do is go into our two scanning functions, the make array of all blocks in grid, and turn off the debug lines so that those aren't in the way anymore. And also in scan column for blocks, I turned that back on too when I was debugging this, so turn that off again. And now everything will be nice and clean when we're running the game in the editor. And now that's the end of the video, for real this time.